the dark secret that changed the fate of England's knights. They marched in the bitter cold of dawn, shrouded in dense mists that seemed to hold secrets time refused to reveal. Their armor gleamed in the pale light of the rising sun, reflecting not only steel, but the weight of centuries of blood and glory. Each step echoed like a silent oath sworn to honor, faith, and death. They were the Knights of England, men forged between the cross and the sword, guardians of an ideal that over the centuries would become a dark mystery, a secret that would forever change the fate of their order and the kingdom itself. Behind the legends and songs sung in the halls, there lay a truth few dared speak, a truth buried among the forgotten tombs of ancient Britain, in the silent crypts where the echo of prayers mingles with the distant sound of dragging chains. Medieval England was not only the birthplace of chivalry, it was also the stage for one of history's greatest contradictions. Faith used as a sword, honor converted into an instrument of power, and in this contrast between light and shadow, between the sacred and the profane, lies the secret that altered the course of the knights, a pact made not just between men, but between forces that transcended human comprehension. Imagine the sound of bells echoing over the hills, calling warriors to battle in the name of God. Each knight knelt before the altar, swearing to protect the weak, serve the king, and fight for the Christian faith. But while the people saw armored saints, in the shadows stirred ambitions that no prayer could purge. The same iron that defended the innocent was used to subdue kingdoms, silence voices, and expand empires. England became a nation divided between the purity of the cross and the corruption of power. And the knights, once symbols of virtue, became pawns in a much darker game. Official history speaks of bravery, victories, and eternal oaths. But the chronicles hide something deeper, a secret alliance sealed in the ashes of the Crusades. When English knights returned from the East with more than swords, they brought with them forbidden knowledge, strange symbols, and a faith tainted by enigmas. What began as devotion ended in conspiracy, and the very men who swore to protect the kingdom became its ghosts, hunted by kings, feared by bishops, and forgotten by history. This is the account of their glory and fall. The distant sound of trumpets that once announced victory now echoes like a lament through the centuries. The fortresses that once dominated the fields have been reduced to ruins, but the secret they carried remains alive, whispered by historians, monks, and dreamers. The truth about the Knights of England lies not in the golden pages of books, but in the shadows that time has tried to erase. And it is into these shadows that we will now delve, to uncover the dark secret that forever changed the fate of the Knights, and with it, the fate of England itself. Medieval England was a kingdom divided between faith and iron, a territory in constant dispute, where power was measured by the number of swords a man could wield. At the heart of this turbulent landscape, the ideal of chivalry emerged, a promise of order amid chaos, of light amid darkness. It was the 12th century, and wars had left the European continent in ruins. Kings needed more than armies, they needed symbols. Thus were born the knights, warriors anointed by the church, elevated to sacred defenders of Christianity, willing to bleed for a purpose that transcended earthly life. English society was structured on a rigid feudal system. At the top, the king, below him, the nobles and landowners, and at the bottom, the people who toiled under the weight of tributes and endless wars. In this hierarchical world, the knight represented a bridge between the sacred and the earthly. He was not just a soldier, he was a chosen man. Trained from childhood, shaped by pain, silence, and discipline, he was taught to see his sword not as a weapon, but as an extension of divine will. Every blow struck on the battlefield was to be an act of faith, every defeated enemy an offering to heaven. But England was not an isolated island of purity. Even as the knights marched under the Red Cross, the kingdom faced internal and external threats that tested the integrity of its faith. The Crusades had opened the doors of the East, bringing riches, spices, and ideas that shook the foundations of European Christianity. From distant lands came reports of ancient temples, mysterious symbols, and texts that spoke of forbidden knowledge, a knowledge capable of challenging the very authority of the Church. While the people saw the Crusades as an act of devotion, Many knights saw them as an opportunity. With papal blessing, English warriors set out for the East in search of glory and forgiveness, but they returned with something that transformed them. They brought not just gold but doubts, not just relics but secrets, and within these secrets lay the beginning of a conspiracy that time would try to erase. The relationship between the English throne and the church was a fragile dance of power and submission. The king needed faith to legitimize his authority, and the church needed the sword to impose divine fear. In this delicate balance, knights became vital instruments, guardians and threats at once. Their loyalty could crown a king or destroy him. And it was from this tension that emerged the secret that would change everything. The moment when faith and power intersected, and knights, once servants of heaven, began to serve a much more earthly and much darker purpose. The people, ignorant of this invisible conflict, saw only the surface, the gleam of armor, the chanting of monks, the parade of banners. But in the silent chambers of monasteries and the shadows of fortresses, a new England was beginning to be forged. An England where the oath of fealty was no longer just to king or god, but to something hidden, powerful and terrible. And it was in this cauldron of faith, ambition and mystery that the secret was born that would seal the knight's fate forever. An era of splendor and bloodshed was dawning. The knights of England ceased to be mere warriors and became the very symbol of national glory. In every castle perched on mist-shrouded hills, in every banner fluttering before cathedrals, the ideal of chivalry took shape. Young nobles, still children, were placed in the care of veteran lords to learn the codes of honor and loyalty. The training was brutal, forged between steel and silence. From an early age, they learned to endure pain, hunger, and fear, for a knight did not belong to himself. He belonged to the king, to the faith, and to the fate of England. The rise of these men was swift and inevitable. The church saw in them the armed arm of divine will, the throne a loyal force capable of commanding respect from rebellious barons and neighboring kingdoms. And the people, oppressed by wars and plagues, saw hope in the knights. They were the living walls separating chaos from order. But beneath the gleam of their golden crosses and polished armor, there was something more. Power began to grow within them, a power neither kings nor bishops could control. With the Crusades, this power found purpose. Landing in the Holy Lands, the English knights witnessed wonders and horrors that challenged their faith. The sands of the East whispered ancient secrets. Forgotten temples held inscriptions that spoke of forces beyond human comprehension. Many returned changed, not only by the battles they had fought, but by the truths they had touched. The boundary between faith and mystery began to blur, and along with it, oaths began to lose their meaning. It was at this point that the first secret orders emerged. Groups of knights who, under the cloak of devotion, began to gather knowledge from pagan cultures, symbols of power, and occult rituals. They claimed to seek the protection of sacred relics, but some whispered they sought something more, mastery over human destiny itself. In this quest, shadowy alliances began to form, and the echoes of these clandestine meetings can still be heard in the cold corridors of ancient English abbeys. Over time, the exploits of these knights became the stuff of legend. They conquered territories, subdued enemies, and transformed England into a feared power. They were venerated as saints and feared as demons. Each battle they won seemed to confirm their invincibility, but it also fed the seeds of arrogance. The line between devotion and ambition became increasingly blurred. The more power they accumulated, the further they distanced themselves from the values they swore to protect. Then England, once united under the cross and the sword, began to feel the cracks within. The knight's faith was mingled with superstition. The ideal of purity was corrupted under the weight of politics and greed. They no longer fought solely for God or the king, but for secrets that could grant eternal power, secrets that, according to the chronicles, should never have been revealed. Thus, the path of ascension also became the harbinger of downfall. Each victory brought them closer to the pinnacle of glory and the abyss that awaited them just beyond. The height of the Knights of England's glory was accompanied by a somber silence, like the calm before a storm. The 13th century dawned under the weight of a power that no longer belonged entirely to the church or the throne. The knights had become something greater and more dangerous. Their fortifications, erected at strategic points throughout the kingdom, housed riches, relics, and, according to whispers among the monks, documents containing secrets capable of shaking the very foundations of Christianity. What began as faith now mingled with something deeper, an ambition that touched the invisible, an obsession with forbidden knowledge, with mastery of the spiritual and the material. It was then that the secret began to reveal itself, not in words, but in deeds. A group of knights returning from the Crusades met in secret in the early hours of London, in underground vaults dug beneath ancient Norman churches. There, under the flickering light of torches, they swore allegiance not to an earthly king, but to a higher truth, a revelation that, they believed, would make them intermediaries between the divine and the human. The symbols that marked their armor no longer represented only the cross of Christ. They began to bear geometric signs, stars, and inscriptions in forgotten languages. What had once been an army of faith was transformed into a brotherhood of mystery. But power calls for fear, and fear inevitably brings fire. When King Edward V learned that some of his knights were accumulating wealth and influence beyond the crown's control, distrust spread like a plague. The church, under pressure, began to question the secret rituals and strange doctrines circulating among the orders. Accusations of heresy, pacts, and occult worship arose. The faith that had once crowned them now condemned them. What had been the army of the cross became, in the eyes of the world, an army of shadows. The night of the fall began in a merciless winter. The doors of the fortresses were broken down. The abbey bells tolled in mourning. Knights were imprisoned, interrogated, and tortured until they confessed to crimes they might never have committed. Others disappeared without a trace, taking with them the secret everyone sought. Bonfires lit in the squares, and the purifying fire devoured steel and flesh with equal fury. Thus ended the cycle of glory. What began as a divine mission ended as a curse. It is said that the night before the executions, a group of knights slipped silently through the northern ports, carrying a sealed chest, an artifact or manuscript that was never found. Many claim it was the secret that had corrupted the order. Others say it was the truth itself that the world was not ready to know. In any case, when the sun rose over the ashes, England was no longer the same. The lances were broken, the crosses burned, and the knights' names, once a symbol of honor, were whispered with fear and reverence. It was there, amid the ruins of power and faith, that the dark secret took hold. A secret that didn't die with them, but hid between the lines of history, waiting to be rediscovered. Because sometimes the greatest enemy lies not in the battles fought under the sun, but in the truths buried in the darkness. When the last flames of the bonfires died out, only silence remained. A heavy silence, the kind that hangs over a field after battle, when the wind blows between the broken lances and the blood dries on the ground. Thus ended the reign of the Knights of England, not with a glorious victory, but with the weight of a condemnation that would echo for centuries. The kingdom, which had once prided itself on its holy warriors, now saw them as traitors, heretics, cursed shadows. The fortresses, once symbols of power and faith, were sacked, their banners torn, and their coats of arms erased from the castle walls. The knights' names were banished from prayers, and the men who survived became wandering ghosts, condemned to wander without cause or honor. But the secret, the one that had changed everything, was not destroyed. On the contrary, it spread like an invisible poison. Some of the knights who escaped persecution found refuge in distant monasteries, assuming new identities. Others fled to lands overseas, taking with them relics, manuscripts, and symbols whose origin no one dared decipher. In the shadows, new fraternities began to emerge, with silent rituals and whispered slogans. Ancient doctrines were reformulated, disguised, and adapted. What had been an order of war and faith became a hidden network, a dark echo of a past that refused to die. The church, fearing the return of these children of the shadow, strengthened its authority. It preached repentance and fear. Sermons reminded the people that even the most saintly can fall, and that disobedience to faith brings the same fate as the condemned knights. Thus, the memory of English chivalry was slowly shaped by guilt. What was once a symbol of virtue became a warning, and subsequent generations grew up hearing stories of knights who sold their souls in search of power. The king, in turn, sought to rewrite history. He ordered the records of the ancient orders burned and confiscated their lands, transforming their riches into the property of the crown. But there are things fire cannot consume. In the most remote corners of England, stories were still told of missing knights who wandered the forests, protecting secrets buried beneath the ruins. Chroniclers spoke of symbols engraved on ancient stones, visible only by moonlight. And each new rumor rekindled the doubt: had the secret truly been destroyed, or merely slumbered? As the years passed, the decline of chivalry became inevitable. The world was changing. Wars were no longer fought for sacred oaths, but for interests and gold. Gunpowder replaced steel. The roar of swords gave way to the boom of cannons. The knight, once the most feared and revered figure, became obsolete, a symbol of a time that would not return. Yet the legacy of the fall remained, and in the shadows of English history, something continued to stir. Something that kings feared, that the church tried to hide, and that the people whispered about with reverence and fear. The truth is, the secret did not disappear with the knights. It survived in the cold stones of abbeys, in the forbidden manuscripts kept by silent monks, and perhaps somewhere in the blood of the descendants of those men who once swore eternal loyalty to the cross. The decline of the knights was not the end. It was the beginning of a new enigma, one that would continue to shape the destiny of England long after the last knight had fallen. Centuries passed, but the marks left by the knights of England never completely disappeared. Time, with all its destructive force, could not erase the echo of the swords that once shone in the light of a divine ideal. Their fortresses crumbled, their names were forgotten in erased records, but the myth survived. It infiltrated the songs of bards, the sermons of monks, the stories told by firesides on winter nights. The people, even without fully understanding the weight of that past, still felt something in the air, an invisible presence, a collective memory that seemed to whisper that the knights were not truly gone. Their legacy transcended the boundaries of war and faith. In every Gothic monument, in every carved stone in ancient English cathedrals, there are symbols that hark back to a time when man believed he could touch the divine through the strength of the sword. But behind the beauty and glory lies a bitter lesson, that all human greatness, when corrupted by ambition, becomes a shadow of its true self. The knights, once sworn to fight for truth, were engulfed by secrets beyond human comprehension, and in seeking to master the mystery, they became part of it. Today, scholars still debate what really happened to England's ancient order of knights. Some say the secret that destroyed them was purely political, a power struggle between the throne and the church. Others believe there was something deeper at work, forbidden knowledge, a revelation that defied the laws of faith and nature. Whatever the case, their story continues to intrigue and fascinate because it reflects something eternal in the human soul, the struggle between the light of devotion and the darkness of desire. The ruins they left behind still stand, covered in moss and silence, like scars of time. And some say that on the coldest nights, one can hear heavy footsteps echoing between the columns of the ancient abbeys, the sound of chains, the dragging of swords, the murmur of prayers in forgotten languages. Were they merely echoes of the wind, or memories of an oath never broken? Perhaps the knights are still there watching, awaiting the day when the secret that cursed them will finally be revealed. The fate of the knights of England is more than a medieval tale. It is a mirror held up to us. It speaks of the price of glory, the danger of power, and the fragility of faith when confronted by ambition. It teaches that, even in the deepest shadows, the search for truth continues. And perhaps this is their true legacy, the reminder that man, in his eternal quest to reach the divine, always runs the risk of losing himself in his own darkness. Because in the end, the dark secret that changed the fate of England's knights doesn't belong solely to their history. It belongs to all of us, to all of humanity, which generation after generation continues to fight the same battle between light and shadow, between faith and corruption, between the heaven we seek and the abyss we create.